And the next one is an exchange of views with the Commission, small-scale fisheries in the EU and Article 17 of the CFP Basic Regulation. So I'd like to welcome the head of unit from the Commission, Mr. Ian McKeed, who from DG Mara, who will be clarifying this important topic. He'll be shedding light on it. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. My name is Owen McKay. I'm from the unit D3 in DG Mara, responsible for the coordination of the Common Fisheries Policy and of the Fisheries Funds. Thank you very much for this invite this morning to discuss these very central elements required for a thriving fisheries community and coastal communities. So this morning in my 5 minutes I would like to outline what's involved with small-scale fisheries and the link with Article 17 of the CFP, and also what the Commission is working on in this regard. Small-scale coastal fisheries play a very important role in terms of the economy for our local coastal communities. There's a strong traditional and cultural element as well to the small-scale sector. Direct employment in the small-scale sector represents 53% of engaged crew. So that means that the large-scale fleet has a slightly smaller share of the engaged crew. So employment is roughly 50-50. And the point I want to make here is that we need both large and small-scale fisheries. They meet very different aspects of the market demand, and they're required to maintain the economy that's supported by the sector as a whole. But by the nature and number of vessels and the scale of operations, their needs and their means are very different. So of the EU fleet of around 69,000 vessels, approximately 80% are small scale, so less than 12 metres. So employment is 50-50 between small and large scale, but there are substantially more small scale vessels. Naturally, smaller vessels hold a smaller volume of catch. So the same small scale vessels, representing about 80% of the fleet, represent only 11% of the EU fleet's gross tonnage. The markets that they serve are also very different. Very broadly, small vessels, fresh fish, local markets within a day of transport, serving the coastal tourism market, for example, versus large scale. You have fish for freezing, processing, exporting, big commercial markets. Funding provides very specific conditions specifically to support the small-scale sector. In the current MFAF, between 21 and 27, almost all projects related to small-scale fisheries are eligible for support with a rate of 100% of public aid. Also, as part of establishing their MFAF programme, Member States were requested to take into consideration specific needs of small-scale fisheries in their funding programme and to describe the actions to meet those needs. You know that we're currently undertaking an evaluation of the CFP regulation, and we're also finalising evaluations of the funds. And this is an opportunity to assess how the current policy and funding helps our small-scale fisheries. The public consultation on the CFP remains open until the 12th of April, so it's good that we spread that message as widely as possible. And we also, during this time and in the recent months, we've been doing targeted work with stakeholders on the CFP evaluation. In the future, or looking towards the future, small-scale fisheries will also be covered by the Ocean Pact. We're working on that at the moment, looking at something coming towards the summer. In the Pact, small-scale fisheries will be put into the broader context of the development of coastal communities, and the Pact will look at ensuring a better coherence with all other EU ocean-related policies. So in the short to medium term, the Pact, the Fishers of the Future study, which we recently finalised, the evaluations of the CFP and of the fund, and in the future, the future vision for 2040, which was mentioned in the Commissioner's mission letter, are what we will be engaging and consulting with in terms of dialogue with the institutions, with Member States, and with stakeholders in the months ahead. Turning to Article 17, transparent criteria on the allocation of fishing opportunities are essential for small-scale fisheries to have their fair share and to attract younger generations. The choice of these allocation criteria lies fully within the remit of the national authorities. They have the best knowledge of their country's own fishers, and the legislation does not foresee a specific role for the Commission in this regard. So that's why we're working in the framework of exchange of information and experiences and identification of best practices. This started with the Fisheries and Oceans package in 2023, where we said we would come with a vademecum on the allocation of fishing opportunities. And the Commissioner mentioned this in his hearing in the PECH Committee as well. So at the moment we're preparing that vademecum. In preparation for that, we asked Member States for additional input on their allocation processes. We received those answers. They were assessed by the STECF, the Scientific Committee, and that they published a report on that in December 23. STECF also made suggestions on improving the transparency and objectivity of those criteria. Last year we started to follow up on that. We launched a consultation with the Member States, advisory councils and social partners and other stakeholders on the points that were raised by the STECF. That consultation closed in April of 24, and we're currently in the process of analysing that input to see what we come with next in terms of the vademecum. And of course, what we come with will depend on the quality of the input received. That's a key criteria for what we can propose. So to conclude my few minutes, small-scale coastal fisheries in the EU are very diverse micro-businesses. They make up a large part of the visual fisheries identity at our coast and the tradition as well. The fund provides preferential treatment for small-scale fisheries, and the transparency of the criteria used and exchange of information and on allocation of fishing opportunities that's applied by the Member States is very important for the existence of the small-scale sector in many cases. And we're committed to driving improvements in this process. We'll continue to work with the Member States, with the stakeholders, with the fisheries, in as much as the Commission's role in the legislation allows. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Ahora paso.
Thank you very much, Mr. McKay. Now we'll take the MEPs, and Mr. Mato is first. Thank you very much. 1.5 minutes, Mr. Mato. Thank you to the European Commission for the report and your explanations. Unfortunately, what the European Commission is telling us is not reflected in facts. Here in this committee, we've always said that small-scale fisheries is a priority for us. We've defended artisanal fishers in many different areas, both when it comes to bluefin tuna quotas and other areas. But that's why there was a very heated debate, despite the fact that the Parliament clearly said when it came to quota allocation, you had to factor in more sustainable small-scale fisheries. We got to an agreement in trilogue, and the consensus was sidelined, and the Council was against what we had agreed on, and the Commission was completely passive during the negotiations. They were a bystander. Article 17. It doesn't meet expectations because it says we will encourage and so on, but there's no obligation for member states to encourage those vessels that use selective gear, and there is no reference to small-scale vessels. So when the Commission says that, oh, for us it's important and that small-scale fisheries is important, we don't see this reflected here. You talk about special funding for small vessels, but that's not true either. There's too much red tape, and you can look at MFAF and whether small-scale vessels tap into MFAF. They don't tap into it very much. And then there's the issue of obsolete vessels. There are also no options for decarbonization, and that doesn't help with generational renewal. We have to change the issue of gross tonnage, of social tonnage, of improving vessels, not fishing more. So I hope that the Oceans Pact will include a clear definition and that we'll really be able to protect the artisanal sector. Now, when it comes to Article 17, the best we can do is amend it. We have to oblige member states to factor in small-scale fisheries. I think small-scale fisheries is of pivotal importance because they harm the environment less and they provide the most benefits to our societies. So the contribution of small-scale fisheries and vessels is vital, and it's our obligation to protect them and defend them.
Miranda.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Miranda.
Yes, President.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you very much, European Commission. I appreciate the fact that you're talking about small-scale fisheries. As you know, small-scale fishers, the collection of shellfish, mussels, oysters, all this kind of farming is extremely important for all our regions, from Brittany to Galicia to Andalusia, the Mediterranean, and other parts of Europe. However, the problem that small-scale fisheries is facing is that it's very difficult to survive. Definitely no decent wages, very harsh working conditions. It's part of tax and quotas, and that makes no sense. That's completely irrational. We've always asked for an exclusion, and the socio-economic impact isn't taken into account. There are populations that are dependent on them, have no other chance. Go to Malpica in Galicia. There is no other activity, so highly dependent on fisheries. And it's not just the fishers, it's those who work in the processing industry and so on. There's a whole chain. Please take into account the whole value chain. That's my plea to the European Commission. In the future revision, please take into account social tonnage, then fishers associations as key bodies that can get funding and that can implement policy, because that will have more of an impact. When the Commission assesses the use of funds, take into account that sometimes the funds haven't been used properly. Sometimes they haven't trickled down to the fisheries sector. We've denounced this on many occasions. In the future Oceans Pact, we need to find a definition. Over the last few years in this committee, we've been working on a definition that takes into account a lot more than vessel length. Now, even the FAO says this, vessel length cannot be enough to define small-scale fisheries. It should be the use of sustainable gear, a distance from the coast. And let me say that small-scale fisheries is the most sustainable. The type of ownership, often vessels are owned by families or micro companies. Sometimes it's one single individual that owns the fishing vessel. So we need to take into account all of this, including excessive red tape. Now, Article 17 hasn't worked well. It hasn't worked for small-scale fisheries, at least not in the way it should have. And in the future, small-scale fisheries can't just be a name or something that the European Commission mentions in its lofty statement, saying that it's great and gives a lot of jobs. Look at the statistics. So many jobs have been lost in small-scale fisheries. It has to be a priority. Mrs. Wiesner.
So much to the Commission for the work that you are doing. I think collecting best practices is very good, but if you may, you should also look at the worst practices. And I think there is an interesting case now ongoing in the Baltic Sea, where we see how the small-scale coastal fisheries are witnessing on that, despite Commission increasing quotas, increasing the quota recommendation for herrings, Council increasing the quotas even further, the small-scale fishermen and fisherwomen simply don't have enough fish. They're witnessing on empty nets and very, very small harvests. So small-scale fishing is actually quitting and running out of business one by one at the coast of Sweden and all across the Baltic Sea. So quotas are increasing, the biomass stock of herring is there, but the small scale simply don't get it. And why is that the case? Well, the large majority, over 80% of the quotas, are allocated to the large-scale trawlers, simply vacuuming the Baltic Sea from the herring. This is not the intention of the common fisheries policies. This is not responsible, and this is not the socio-economic effects that the CFP was intended for. So also look at the worst case. What's happening in the Baltic Sea, I think, is a really good example of that, and please come up with recommendations on how we can avoid this. The quotas needs to be allocated to the small scales, and it's not acceptable, the situation that we're currently seeing.
Señor Flanagan.
Mr. Flanagan.
Thank you very much. Everyone here knows that Article 17 requires member states to allocate fishing opportunities based on social, environmental and economic criteria rather than relying primarily on historical catch track records that favour industrial fisheries, which is excellent in theory. We also know that quota allocation is national competence of member states. However, we continue to hear from small-scale fishers that they have difficulties accessing valuable quota species due to quota allocations being concentrated in the industrial fleet. More than a decade on, Article 17 has not been effectively implemented to achieve its aim of opportunities allocated according to social, environmental and economic criteria. Many people have said this here today. In 2023, the Commission indicated that it would prepare a vademecum on the allocation of fishing opportunities in order to improve transparency, promote sustainable fishing practices across the EU and support small-scale and coastal fisheries. Now, the question I have is, what is the timeline for the release of this vademecum and what can we expect regarding its content and format? Second question, will the evaluation of the CFP include an assessment of the implementation of the status of Article 17? Will the vademecum have an implementation network? And will the Commission develop a detailed binding implementation plan for Article 17 and clear guidelines and developing and applying transparent and objective criteria to reward sustainable fishing practices and protect ecosystems and local communities? You also mentioned MFAP funding and you mentioned the fact that fishers could get 100%. The reality is that in Ireland, if members were allowed to get 10,000%, it wouldn't make any difference because unless they spend the money in advance, they can't get access to this funding. These people don't have this money. So it's a bit like saying, well, why aren't they accessing it? It's a bit like saying, I leave all my food on a 10-metre shelf in my kitchen and then I question, why is no one taking it? No one can reach it. It is there in theory, but it's not accessible. What can be done to change this?
Señora Lekalenek.
Mrs. Lekalenek. Thank you very much. Personally, I don't think we shouldn't pit small-scale fisheries against large-scale fisheries. This discussion, Article 17, reminds us that fisheries is a crucial sector and contributes to food security in the EU. It creates direct and indirect jobs. Now, we want to help new fishers enter the sector, to help with generational renewal, especially in small-scale fisheries. We want to deal with obstacles to accessing the market. So what is the Commission planning to do, and how can the MFAF play a role, and how can we get more visibility on quotas and make sure that fishers don't face the whole issue of all or nothing? Then there's the issue of selective gear. I think we should think about state aid once again. I'd like to insist that the European Commission should accept looking at the issue of gross tonnage and engine power applied to the fleet. I think we need to do so to improve working conditions. Now, allocation methods have to be drawn up with the real involvement of fishers and their communities and regional players. All fishing fleet segments need to be involved. This is in the resolution. We need the best scientific advice to underpin all of this, and they need to be based on modern technology and especially artificial intelligence that our own European companies are developing. Thank you.
Levin.
Mrs. Levin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So small-scale fisheries, I think it's interesting to keep some figures in mind, that it's 76% of the active fleet and 53% of the engaged crew, but it's only 19% of the value landed. So if we really want to promote local economies and the social dimension of fisheries, of course, then we must make sure that we can provide the small-scale fishermen with as much quota as possible. And the Article 17 says that member states shall use transparent and objective criteria, including those of environmental, social, and economic nature. And I'd like to ask the Commission, I'm not aware that the Commission actually has made a mapping of all the member states, how they are using, what criteria they are using. I'd also like to suggest that those facts would be published. It would be very interesting to have an EU public register listing the processes and outcomes related to the allocation of fishing opportunities in the name of transparency, and for citizens to know exactly why quotas are allocated in a certain manner. Then I also think that the EU vademecum on Article 17 should provide clear guidance for member states to utilize quota allocation to deliver on biodiversity objectives and on climate mitigation objectives as well. This is the instrument that we have to keep our fishing industry alive, but also reaching the objectives that we have. Thank you.
Señora Llamet.
Mrs. Jamy. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I think that we all agree. Article 17 throws up problems. When it comes to efficiency, or rather its inefficiency, I'm tempted to say, we all agree that we need a very specific definition of what artisanal fisheries is as opposed to large-scale fisheries. I find that Article 17 it just encompasses too much. And that is why it has cruelly proven to be quite harmful to our small-scale fishers. We need to do something about this, because this pseudo-environmental view of the European Commission crops up again and again, and it seems to be more important than the economic issues that have an impact on men, women, families, and, let us not forget, our food sovereignty. This technocratic approach, if I might put it that way, and very kind of this blanket approach doesn't distinguish between the different types of fisheries. We've got small-scale fisheries, industrial fisheries, or what I call funded fisheries, if I might put it that way, and no distinction are made when it comes to quotas. I think we need a new article, a specific article on quota allocation in the case of small-scale fisheries, and the main criterion should be profitability and the rate of return. So I think that this is vital for small-scale fishers. Nowadays, whether we have Article 17 or not, the main problem is that fishers cannot fish with the West Med plan in the Mediterranean. They can't fish in the Bay of Biscay because of the ban. And that is because we've never accepted taking into consideration profitability, and that is vital for their survival. Thank you.
Señora Furro.
Mrs. Fourreau. Article 17 is still not implemented properly, and that harms small-scale fishers. The evaluation of the CFP prepared by the Commission, will that include a proper assessment? Because we've got the issue of fishing opportunities, and I don't think the situation is fair. Could the Commission vademecum lead to a roadmap, as Luke Flanagan asked for? I fully echo Mrs. Wiesner's comments on the Baltic. Ecosystems are collapsing, but most quotas are given to a handful of industrial fishers, while we should be doing the opposite. We should be making sure that we focus on fish for human consumption. And bluefin tuna, same in France. The small fishers just get peanuts. So we need to make sure that fishing practices are in line with social and environmental the dimension. This helps fishers, generational renewal, and we have Denmark as a good example because it also boosts biodiversity. Has the European Commission taken into account this recent Guardian survey that shows there are huge inequalities and that it's very difficult for small producers, small fishers, and aquaculture farmers to access funding. So, could you envisage a more sustainable and fair CFP? Thank you.
Ahora voy a hablar como...
Thank you. I'm going to speak now with my MEP hat on and not as a chair. And let me start off by thanking Mr. Owen McKay, who's here with us today. I'm very familiar with small-scale fisheries, especially in the Mediterranean. We think that the small-scale fleet needs to get proper and fair quota allocation. That is vital for its survival, and it also helps with coastal diversification. We need to look at how this can contribute to diversification in coastal areas. We also need to improve access to funding. It's not easy for the sector to have access, and this would play a very important role in renewing the fleet and decarbonizing, and this isn't happening. It will help them, we need to help them access funding more effectively. Now, we need to think about the future reform of the CFP and the Oceans Pact. We need a regulation that can look at its future viability. We need to help the sector. And then, of course, there's the issue of the legal recognition of cofradías, of fishers associations. And we know that it's up to the member states to lay down the criteria for fishing opportunities, but the sector itself levels criticism against this. They say that the criteria used by the member states aren't always clear and objective, and the Commission needs to make sure that the criteria are objective. Yes, it's the member states that have to establish this, but the Commission needs to needs to check that it's being done properly. Small-scale fisheries help coastal areas survive, and we need to make sure that any changes to the CFP are beneficial. Thank you very much. And I'm going to give the floor to Mr. McDowett. I hope that I am pronouncing your name properly. I believe it's Mr. McKay. In fact, I hope you can now take the floor so that you can answer.
Okay, very good. Thank you. I took a couple of notes. I won't address one by one because there's a lot of similar themes. So let me just broadly address the similar themes that came up. There was quite a lot on funding, where the notion of a special funding for small-scale fisheries was addressed, that sometimes the funds don't trickle through or that the money isn't there on the shelf. Let me just come back to the way the MFAF works at the moment, is that it's a national envelope that's allocated and managed by the managing authority in the member state. Of course, as Commission, we work closely with that managing authority bilaterally to try and see how the funds are being allocated and to give the right pushes and work on finding where there are blocking factors and get that funding through. As part of the national programme, it was also important that the member states drafted a small-scale coastal fisheries action plan, and that considered where the funding needed to be allocated. State aid was also mentioned. State aid is available. There's up to 40,000. Additional national funding can be provided to small-scale coastal fisheries. Again, up to 100% of the costs of the investments, and that's coming from the national budget. The recent reform of the de minimis regulation also simplified the process and increased the applicable ceiling up to €40,000. So that's as well as the MFAF support. Not to mention supports that can be had under other EU funding. There was a couple of comments on the vademecum itself and whether the Commission has made a mapping of the allocation criteria. This is what I was trying to explain at the start with our consultation of the Member States. First of all, our questionnaire to the Member States, then our STEC report, the analysis of those answers, and then we come back and we're engaging again with the Member States there. The difficulty comes back to the definition in Article 17, where the legislation doesn't give a specific role to the Commission there, other than to say that the choice for the allocation of criteria for fishing opportunities is in the remit of the national authorities, and that they should be, as many people mentioned, transparent and objective and based on the three pillars. Yes, one last thing I wanted to say on the funding. Of course, I've been speaking about the MFAF, which runs 21 to 27. Last week there was a proposal or a commission paper published on the future MFF and how that might look. And as part of that publication, there were 7 public consultations launched. The shape of the future MFF is not known, so we don't know if we're going to be talking about national envelopes working with the managing authority, as I've just been saying. What we do currently for the MFAF, we don't know exactly what the shape will be in the future, so it's very important that we receive contributions via the public consultation that will help shape the MFF and make the case for funding for fisheries and oceans and small-scale fisheries. Thank you.
Pues muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. Do we have time? Yes. Mrs. Levine.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Just a follow-up question to the Commission, where you mentioned that there's no role for the Commission to follow up on the using of objective and transparent criteria. I was under the impression that the CFP was a common fisheries policy that applied to the whole of Europe, and the Commission is the guardian of the treaty, so I don't see why you should not have a role in making sure that that member states are abiding by regulations. Thank you.
Sí, simplemente en las líneas de lo que ha dicho mi...
Yes, along the lines of what my colleague said, the CFP says that member states have to promote responsible fisheries, giving incentives to those operators that fish in a way that's the least damaging to the environment and provides the most benefits to societies. So if the Commission has nothing to say, given this, then I think that the reply that the Commission representative gave is very worrying. Mr. Flanagan.
Owen, thanks for your answers, but specifically on the MFAF funding and the inability of small-scale fishers to access it because they need to spend it first. These people are trying to put together plans which they could get funding for, but they don't have the money in the first place to do it. And in other areas, I'm on the Agriculture Committee for the last 10 years, and with CAP funding, they're being told at home, sorry, you can't do that with EU funding, but somehow you can do it with CAP funding. Because at the moment, it is as well off that the money wasn't there. Because I'll go back to my analogy again. They're looking at it on this very, very high shelf. They're told, why don't you grab it? And no one is giving them a ladder or steps to get to it. And how do we get around this? Because Article 17 is not working in so many ways, and this is even making it worse, and is causing a lot of frustration.
Señora Le Callennec.
Mrs. Le Callennec.
Oui, merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much. I'm a bit worried because you talked about the MFF and you're mentioning the contributions that you receive, but I imagine, surely, can't be the case that DG Marine doesn't have an opinion. It can't not have an opinion yet. Certainly having listened to us as well, the views of our committee. It would be interesting to hear their proposals.
Le damos la palabra ahora a la Comisión para finalizar.
I'll give the floor to Mr. McKay from the Commission for his final comments.
Thank you very much. Just a clarification on the role of the Commission. Indeed, that may have I may have misspoken there. It's not that there isn't a specific role of the Commission in the CFP. That's not what I intended at all. But what there is not a specific role for the Commission in how the member states allocate their criteria. That's fully a national competence. fully in the remit of the national authorities. So what the Commission is trying to do is to work in the framework of exchange of information and experiences and best practices, and to put them out there in the form of the vademecum. So like I said, we asked Member States for their additional information on their allocation process. We're analysing that, and the quality of the input that we get from the Member States, because this is entirely in their remit, will give us the information that we can put in the vademecum and proceed on that basis, and come with suggestions on what can be addressed and how to address it in the best possible way. On the MFF and not having access to funding, that's what I was trying to get at with my remark on replying to the public consultations, because the delivery model of the MFF will be different to what we've seen in the last funding periods. Business as usual is not an option. I'm just quoting from the communication. So it's clear that the expectations from the EU to act are steadily increasing in all different areas, and business as usual is not an option. Choices will have to be made to maximise the impact of every euro that's there, and to spread it and focus on the EU priorities where EU action is most needed. And of course, within DG Mare and our Commissioner, we are fully advocating that EU action is critical in this policy area. And we must do what we can for society, for the planet, to have healthy oceans and a thriving competitive fisheries industry that supports our rural and coastal communities. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Y ya con este...
Thank you very much. So as you know, this brings us to the end of what we have to do this morning. We'll start again at 2:30.